Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to 6 Dimension CQ5 uh, Development Setup, Maven Build and Deployment webinar. Today we're going to talk about building and deploying your projects for CQ5 with a special focus on Apache Maven and best practices. Just a real quick word about myself. I've been in the WSMS space for a little bit over 5 years. I started off working with EMC Web Publisher, and then I've moved on to Drupal, and now my primary focus is Adobe CQ5. I've participated in a whole bunch of WCMS implementations, everything from migrations, support enhancements, to new implementations, for all different size of projects with all sorts of different technologies and builds. So anything from a 10-person implementation for a large energy corporation to probably hundreds person implementation for a large auto manufacturer to a 5-person team for a relatively small parts manufacturer. So I've seen how this is done. I've seen a bunch of ways that it's worked, and probably more importantly, the ways that it hasn't. So I've got some good ideas on how I think we can improve our build process for CQ, and I'd like to share them with you. So the purpose of this webinar is to understand why all this is important. Your project structure, your build process, and your deployment processes, and then to explore the different methods and learn about all the best practices and tools that are out there to make your jobs easier. And if you do have any questions, at all, feel free to ask. So Michael Townsend, yes, the slides will be available. We'll be posting them. It'll probably take a day or two, just to get the video converted and everything, but everything will be available after the webinar. And if you'd like, we can certainly follow up with an email. So, why is my build process important? This is something that I have heard several times. People say, well, it's really not that big of a deal. Our code gets deployed, or I'm on a small project, or, it works. Why change it? Why rock the boat? And I think that there are some real problems if you have a subpar build process. And the first one, the most problematic, really is chaos. Just as a quick summary, I guess. If you don't, especially if you don't have a good source control system or a way to get your code out of source control, you may not be sharing a complete code base. So that means not just, that the apps might be incomplete, but also, if you don't have all of your workflows, all that sort of stuff inside of source control and deployed as part of your application, you don't have a full picture of what your application is. If you don't have a good build system, you may not be versioning your code or your application properly. So, if you end up where you're deploying stuff that you don't version, you may not necessarily know what you have deployed, which is a bad situation. And you probably won't have a single version of the truth. So that means that you might not understand exactly what code is in production and exactly what code is in development and what's the difference between them. So, if you can't say, here's my code at this exact moment in time, it can get real problematic for trying to trace down bugs. You also probably have a slower build process. If you have to do manual steps, you're going to be having developers spending time doing those, and it'll slow down developers, and it'll slow down testing. Finally, you'll probably have a difficult release process. If you don't have your build process nailed down, your release process isn't going to be either, and most likely it's going to you're going to have problems make it repeatable. So these are all the things that result in the bad build process. Even though you can deploy code without a good build process, there's still problems. So I guess the next thing is to look through the build processes that are out there. So, I've highlighted 4 build processes. The first 2 are kind of manual. So, and all of these I've actually seen on projects. So these aren't, just blue sky type things. These are things that people have done. So build from CRXDE and packages. This is kind of the way that Adobe gives you stuff. They give you CRXDE, they give you the package manager. These are the tools that you have right out of the box. But if you build code this way, it's really tough to not have chaos occur. One of my coworkers, Bryce, who ran that 5.5 upgrade webinar, he worked on a client. I guess you could say it's a bank of the world. And they did this sort of approach, and it was like almost every day you'd hear something about how something else went wrong, because they were constantly having trouble with integrations, because they had several developers that were working on the same code and they're sharing it with packages, and they needed to constantly merge those packages together. So if you're using packages to share code between developers, you really want to consider if there's a better option. The next option is to use CRXDE and Subversion. It's built in. You can share code, but your builds are not going to be as streamlined. And I've honestly found the SVN integration somewhat awkward. When it comes down to CRXDE too, something I've noticed is people that use CRXDE as their primary IDE tend to avoid writing bundle code as much. I think because it's actually kind of somewhat awkward in CRXDE. And I think that that's kind of unfortunate, because you tend to end up with more spaghetti code and less code reuse. And I have seen too, clients that use this, and when I got on site with one of the clients, the first thing that even the business said is, we don't understand our build process, because if you're building things through CRXDE, it's a lot less clear, and it's not going to be automatic. So kind of the next step up is to have an automatic build. One of the first options which I've seen is using any IDE out there. We'll say Eclipse, just because it's free, and it's the one that I use. But Eclipse and Ant. And Ant, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's a build tool for Java. It is very, very customizable. It can be run automatically. It supports just about everything. But it's so configurable, and so much configuration is required, you actually have to do a lot of development to get your builds to deploy. Most of the stuff that you want to do for CQ isn't going to be out of the box. I was on another project for a government institution, and we tried to use Ant, and the amount of time that we spent just massaging our Ant scripts to get it to comply with the way CQ accepted things was just it was a lot of time. And this Ant's kind of a nice tool for some things. Like we did use it pretty successfully to run extracts. So we used it as kind of almost like a scripting language to keep calling Vault, and using Vault to extract and do some massaging before it was imported into a different repository. But overall, I think Ant probably doesn't really have everything you need. I just want to make sure everybody can hear me. If anybody else is having questions, please, or having trouble hearing me, let me know. And then I guess the final build process is using again an external IDE and Maven. The advantage of Maven being that it's customizable. But it's based on convention rather than configuration. So as long as you follow the convention, most people have already figured all this stuff out. So the tasks that you're going to want to do for CQ, like building bundles, that sort of thing, are just available as plugins. And it also includes dependency management, which just saves so much time in trying to trace down jars and all that sort of stuff, and makes your project setup a lot easier. Overall, I just think that Maven and an external IDE is by far the best way to build a project for CQ. So One thing I've been thinking about, is how do we fit all of this into sort of a hierarchy? How do we put it all together and see how projects stack up? And as a base, I use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which Maslow was a psychologist who described what a person needs in order to become a fulfilled individual, as kind of a pyramid like this. So starting at the very bottom, we have source control. So source control maps on Maslow's hierarchy to breathing, water, food. So everything you need to stay alive, and having source control is absolutely essential to have a successful project. Next up would be a documented build process, and this actually maps to safety, which I think is really, fortuitous as well, because a documented build process ensures that you have a safe build process and a well understood build process, and it's something that should be followed. So, these two are the foundation of having a decent build, having something that, you could succeed with. One up from there is having a one-step build and deploy. And this is where we start getting into making it pleasant. So, you can survive on the first two, but you really want to make things easier. And having a one-step build, it may be 2 or 3 clicks, but having one process to build and deploy is going to make your process so much easier for your developers. Going to make things quicker, and you're going to have less errors. If you have to do 2 or 3 things, or maybe even more in a sequence, it's really hard. It's really hard to keep that without missing something. Next would be a single build artifact, and what that means generally is a single package, like a CQ package of all your code. That's going to make your deployments easier. You're going to have easier time doing releases and easier time tracking your builds and releases if you have one thing that comes out of this whole process. And finally, kind of at the pinnacle, we've got automated scheduled builds. With automated scheduled builds, we're talking about kind of continuous integration. It really does lower your risk, and you're going to spend less time because someone doesn't have to sit there to do builds, and you can tell earlier on if something breaks, rather than waiting for everybody to get everything integrated and potentially having issues later. And one of the questions I think a lot of people ask is, what's all included in this build process? Are we talking about just code, configuration? And I would say yes. Inside this process, you're talking about code, configuration, design. The only thing that wouldn't be built with this is the actual content. Content's handled separately, and they provide some great tools for passing around content and managing content. But this is specific to applications, configurations, and that sort of thing. And of course, your designs. So actually, as a side note there, I would say, this does include, your workflow configurations, all that sort of stuff should be pushed along with everything, because you don't want to have to manage those separately. So real quick here, I just want to do a poll, just a minute or two here, of what everybody has on their organization for, building, how far along you guys are in the hierarchy of needs. And feel free, if you're to check multiple boxes if you may have some things but not others. Okay, I think that's pretty good. Got about 75% of the people that voted. And so go ahead and share it real quick. So, good news is looks like just about almost everyone has source control. But you can see here that CQ project teams still have a fair amount of ways to come to kind of get up to the pinnacle building. It does seem that I think a lot of people that work on CQ projects that have come from a Java background would say the same thing, that just because of the way CQ works, our build processes might not be quite as sophisticated as, say, like a Java enterprise project. All right, so let's just talk about implementing Maven builds. The quote there is from the guy who wrote Maven 1 and is still involved in the project. So, the thing to remember about Maven is its convention, and they want everything to be the same. So we'll go. So to get that sort of convention, we want to talk about some build rules. First thing is that your build should be platform agnostic. It should run the same way, whether you're doing it from the IDE, command line, or continuous integration, and it shouldn't invoke any system commands. So don't call wget, curl, anything like that, because we're building Java code after all. There's no reason to make it dependent on a particular operating system or anything. Why make your build process not as good as your language? So the next one is that it should perform all the operations. It should compile, build, and deploy your code, and you shouldn't have manual intervention required. The reason for that being that, if you have manual intervention, you have the potential for errors. I know I've been on a project where we had, it compiled and built the code, and then it was up to the developer to deploy it. And more than once, I'd open up the package manager, or I'd have a couple open, and realize that I'd either gotten close to or deployed to development. Which, if they happened to be having demos or anything like that, would have been a really bad situation. So, as much as possible, it should do everything. And then finally, your properties should be centralized. So what that means is that as many of your properties as possible should be stored inside the root or reactor POM, and then referenced in all the submodules, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And then you really want to keep things in the POMs, which is the Maven configuration files, rather than inside of like the Maven profile, which which is a file per user. The reason being, you don't want to have users synchronize back and forth. The only thing really that you want to store in the profile is passwords and usernames and stuff like that you don't want necessarily anyone to see. So project structure for CQ. Like I said, Maven has the concept of a reactor, which is kind of like a root project, and that manages the building of all of the submodules, which are the sub-projects. It can also contain properties. Usually you'll put like organization information in there, so you got your copyrights and all that sort of stuff. And this is kind of the way that I like to set up a CQ project. And this would also be the build order. So you've got the root, which then invokes the core, which is kind of the base foundation for all the other code. It's imported by almost everything else. Next are the OSGI services, and then the taglibs and servlets, since they often invoke the core and the services, come next. And then finally, I generally have, well, not finally, but next I have a Vault project. Now, there are a couple ways of doing this. Some teams prefer to have one project for your application, one project for your designs. It's perfectly acceptable. It really doesn't matter that much. It's just how you like things arranged. And then the final project, which is I call package, is the one that contains the information for the CQ package that's going to be developed or going to be built, and then it's also got the configuration of how to build that package. So once all of the other projects are complete, that project grabs all the other code and builds a single package and then installs that. And then one of the other important things about Maven, building code in Maven, is dependencies. So the way the dependency resolution works in Maven is that you specify some information like a group ID, artifact ID, and version of the code that you want it to download, and those are all unique values. And Maven will find a jar, download it for you, and make it available, assuming one is available. And the way it does this is it looks inside of, by default, a central repository of open source code. Now, since CQ is an open source, the code for CQ isn't available there. So we have some options on how we get that code. The first one is to host a Maven repository. And generally speaking, if you have the capability of doing this, it's the best way to go. You have the most control, so you can add any number of sub-repositories there, and you can deploy your own code to that repository. So it's a good way to share code between teams, because you build a project, you deploy the code, and the other team just needs to add a dependency into their projects to use it. But it's a Java application, so you have to, you can't run it on just any old, HostGator or anything like that. So it is hosting costs. There's definitely some setup, and you'll need to be on the internet or most likely a corporate VPN to be able to access it. You generally wouldn't want to make this available to just anybody. The next option is, and it's actually kind of clever too, I think, is to use CQ as your local Maven repository. It's pretty easy to do. It's just a package that you install and a little bit of configuration, and it's always available. But you're not sharing it with your team. If you have different versions of CQ or different hotfixes installed, you may have slightly different code. And it's generally not the best option if if you have a team at all, really. The third option is to use Adobe's Maven repository, which they make available at the URL you can see on your screen. It's going to be the latest code. So the 5.4 branches, they've already got some stuff out there. It's like 5.4.1, 5.4, whatever. You can browse that repository, which is kind of nice. But you can't deploy artifacts. It requires internet access, and it requires it to be up, which there was definitely some problems earlier on with it going down at times. Or sorry, yeah, 5.5. So they have a code available already for 5.5.1 or later. So overall, as much as possible, if you can set up a hosted Maven repository, it's going to be the best way to go. Obviously, that's not going to work for everyone. So the next thing I guess we want to talk about real quick is some tools that are out there that make your lives as developers or your lives as people to manage teams easier. So the first one is the M2E, which is a Maven plugin for Eclipse. Obviously, it allows you to run Maven builds, but it also allows you to import projects, Maven projects, from any source control system or from the file system. So with that tool, you can point it at a Maven project. It'll pull down all the code, and it'll actually set up all the projects for you. So it goes through the reactor and creates a project for all of your Maven modules, and then it sets them up correctly and pulls in the dependencies. So in a matter of minutes, depending on how much it's got to download, obviously, but in a matter of minutes, you can be ready to go with code completion and all that sort of stuff. It's a very cool tool once you get used to it. And then definitely one of the other things I'd recommend is Vault Clips, which is a tool for importing and exporting code. I have not used Vault Sync yet. I'm a little embarrassed to admit. I would be interested to see how well it works. I've had some trouble with Vault being a little touchy before, but Vault Sync works really well. That would probably work just as well as Vault Clips for keeping your code in sync. And then I guess the final thing is I'd recommend using the J2EE version of Eclipse. It includes a lot of editors that you'll need, for your JSPs and all that sort of stuff that aren't included by default. So rather than adding things in one at a time, the J2EE version of Eclipse is a little bit bigger, but it makes your life easier. And thank you, Ruben, for bringing that up too. Now, just real quick, some plugins that are going to be needed. The bundle plugin for Maven. Both of these are both of these are produced by Apache Felix. So the bundle plugin creates OSGI bundles from your Java projects, and then the Maven SCR plugin, which runs before that, and it generates it generates SCR XML files, which basically tell OSGI how to load services based on annotations that you put in your code. So both of these are essential, and honestly just put them in there and they do their thing. The bundle plugin is actually very flexible, so you can use it to embed dependencies and all that sort of thing, but out of the box it works with no configuration. And then the next thing is, deploying your code. So the option that I would probably recommend, largely because it's produced by 6 Dimensions, is we do have a deploy plugin. It deploys bundles, which is kind of a cool feature. So you can use this to deploy standalone bundles and to deploy packages. So it deploys them to the same location. It interacts with the legacy API. It's easy to use, and it is available in the Maven Central repository. It isn't quite as full-featured as the Content Package plugin, which Adobe created. So that's the next one there. The Content Package plugin allows you to interact with the CQ Package Manager through quite different ways, and it is pretty easy to use. The only thing I did notice is it doesn't seem to deploy bundles separately. And then the final option, which seems to be the old way of doing things, is to use Groovy or curl scripts. They are completely custom, but it's more code that you got to maintain. I've seen the Groovy scripts where it's 200 lines of Groovy, and if you've got to make changes to it, it's more code that you need to change just to get your build to work. So I would say they're probably not as future-proof as using a plugin that someone else is going to be maintaining. So I think we've got a pretty good grasp on Maven. So I'm going to do a real quick poll here, and just it says how familiar are you, but just take this as how familiar were you before you attended this this seminar. And again, we're just going to let this go for about a minute or so. So as for the question about Vault Sync, I have not personally used it. If anybody's got any thoughts on it, I'd like to hear them, and maybe we can address that once the webinar is over, because I would be interested in hearing how it works. All right. So let's just share this real quick. So it looks like everybody's at least heard of Maven, and actually, a good number of people have used it too. So, glad that people have been using it, because it is a very great tool for building for CQ especially. And honestly, I started using Ant, and Maven is a lot easier. Okay, so talking about continuous integration. Again, integrate early and integrate often. Actually, and so I got a couple questions about the Sling Maven plugins and some of the other plugins. Yeah, I mean, there are many plugins that we can use. The ones that that I did reference are the ones that are needed. The Sling Maven plugin, the reason that I didn't mention that is I've actually had issues where the Sling Maven plugin deploys a jar, and then you deploy the jar as part of a package, and the JVM doesn't understand that those two are that the jars are equivalent, and so you end up with 2 copies of the same code, and it produces all sorts of really hard to debug issues, which seems like the only way to get rid of them is to restart the OSGI console. So regarding continuous integration, though, sorry, I get track of my mouse again. Continuous integrations, a dedicated server application that continuously deploys your code. It should run automatically. Most of them allow you to kick builds off manually. And you can see the logos of some of the options there. So you got Jenkins and Hudson. Jenkins being the successor of Hudson. Apache Continuum, Bamboo. So there's a number of good options. Bamboo is kind of nice if you don't necessarily want to have the resources of a dedicated server, because they will run it on the Amazon cloud. And Jenkins and Hudson both are really, really, really simple to start up or to set up. So a lot of good options, really. And some of the benefits of continuous integration, integrate early and often, which, the longer you let your integrations go, the more likely you are to end up in integration hell, where you have conflicting changes, where you have, different branches going in different directions, and you got to integrate that all back in. You spend more time trying to figure out what's wrong with your code than actually writing it. You have constant and frequent builds, which is nice because you don't have a stale build sitting out in development while the code's been changing, so you have a good snapshot of what you're doing. Automated deployments, so there's not someone sitting there clicking a button or spend their time doing that. And you can get early warnings of broken code. So I guess the anecdote I'd have for that is I was on a project where we had teams in 3 different countries and 2 states, I believe. And we were all working on code, and we'd have, these really strange issues where we come in and everything is, you upload or update your code and things would stop working. And eventually we ended up deploying continuous integration. We find that one of the teams had been consistently checking in broken code, and since we'd known, the moment that code got checked in, that the build broke, we knew who did it. It makes that stuff a lot easier. You can also do automatic unit tests and code quality checks, JUnit, just for all of your bundles. And there's some great tools out there like check styles and find bugs, both of which help you fairly obviously find bugs and improve your code. And you can actually get a nice little graph of how your code changes over time. And the final one, which I've kind of alluded to, is the blame feature, that it'll email out whoever checked in the code that breaks the build, and let everybody know, so you don't have to wonder who broke the build and try to track them down and that sort of thing. So now, as for best practices, I don't think that any of these servers are so much better than one another that it really matters which one you use. So any Maven capable server will work. And this continuous integration server should only install to dev, or development, or integration, or whatever you call it. It shouldn't publish to testing or quality assurance or production. You actually really don't even want it to be capable of doing those, because if you do that, there's a potential that you'll do it accidentally, which is just not good. So, you should have a manual process that's run by the people that maintain the servers to deploy to those subsequent environments. And when it does deploy to development, it should deploy both to author and publish, so there's no manual intervention involved at all there. It should run at least daily, and ideally quite a bit more. There's a lot of people out there that encourage building every time the code's updated. That depends on your needs. I personally think that polling every couple hours and then building code's a good way to go, because then you give time for the environment to be stable. If you have a lot of check-ins, it can make it hard for people that are trying to make sure that their changes are in place. Whereas if you do it every couple hours, you give people time between builds. And it should use the same build process. That's kind of comes down to the same Maven fundamentals, that you should be using the same build process no matter where you are. with Maven, you can configure Maven to deploy to multiple different locations. You can override properties, all that sort of stuff. So if your CI needs to have different properties, that's fine, but it still should invoke the same routines. And now I think we've got a pretty good idea, of how all this works, and we'll try to put it all together. So, it starts off with a developer. Developer writes their code, uses Maven to install, or uses any number of Vault Sync or Vault Clips to synchronize their code back and forth to CQ, to testing repeats. And once they got things ready, they go ahead and push it into their source control system. That would be anything from Git to Subversion, even CVS if you wanted. Doesn't really matter, just as long as it's somewhere. The continuous integration server would pull the code off of the SCM system, create a build, and deploy it using that same Maven build process into the integration or the development CQ instance. Now, let's just say that another developer had written some conflicting changes and they hadn't updated. So that breaks the build here, or it breaks something on this server. Since you're doing continuous integration and it's happening a lot, you would notice those issues quicker. So the developer goes back through, makes some more changes, pushes it in again, and goes through the whole process again. Now once your code's ready to go, you create a release. I would say we probably could have a whole webinar on releases as well. There's a whole bunch of best practices around creating releases and releasing code to CQ, and how to do that, because with the way that CQ has the multiple layers of caching and all that sort of stuff, it is a fair process to get code deployed in a way that doesn't introduce any risk and make sure that everything gets published. But we can kind of cover that at a later time, I think. And then now that we understand how the whole process works, I think we'll talk about a few things that aren't necessarily solved even if you have a great build process. The first would be, integrating changes from CSS folks and designers and front-end developers, whatever you want to call them. Since CQ's components largely rely on developers changing or integrating with CSS, you generally do have to make some changes. At the same time, a lot of times front-end developers will be making changes as well, minor tweaks, that sort of thing. And integrating that is always kind of a problem. It seems like, from the projects that I've been on, the best solution is to give everyone an instance of CQ and to have them use the same tools. But there's usually some pushback about that. So if anybody's, again, found a really good solution to this, I'd be glad to hear it. But that seems like a problem that's still out there and something you got to be careful about. One of the other problems is, if you have a large team, duplicating code or sharing things, that you don't necessarily want. I've been on a project for a large automobile corporation, and when they introduced their .com website, they'd already made a framework for their international and all the other brands. And because there was such a large team and they didn't really communicate that well, they ended up duplicating a lot of code. To some degree, continuous integration makes this a little bit better, but it's still going to be a problem if you don't plan things out well and you don't communicate that well. Naming conflicts can also be a bit of a problem. With the way that CQ does its inheritance, you need to make sure that you have a design ahead of time. And all the sort of good fundamentals for a project. Otherwise, who knows what text means. So, and then finally, one of the problems that I've run into a couple times is misalignment. So, you have two teams or even more working on a project. They have interdependent code, or one project's dependent on another project, and they release on two different cycles. So one of the ones I'm on right now, they were doing a global project, and because of some internal issues, that's been slowed down, and it's put a whole bunch of other stuff that's dependent on that on hold. And it's one of those problems that you're just going to have, and that's one of the reasons too I'd encourage, not just use of source control management, but a really advanced use of it for these sort of projects. Just because you're on CQ doesn't mean that branches and tags go away. If you develop on branches, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to manage multiple project tracks. So that's really about it. I hope that everybody's enjoyed the webinar. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to point them out. Okay, so let's see. First one, Bob Jones asked if we've looked into the Blueprints Maven archetype. And yeah, I have. I've looked at it, and I actually really do like that Maven archetype. I haven't used it yet, but yeah, the idea of setting up an archetype and using an archetype to get yourself started is really a great one. I'm not sure what all plugins that they include in there, but yeah, that's if you're using an archetype, it'll make your life easier. And then Ryan asks, handle content development in this process. Yeah, I think I tried to cover that a little earlier. But no, content I generally treat as something quite a bit different rather than integrating content development and deployment into the overall build process. There are some kind of awkward, places between pure content and pure code. Designs would be the foremost of them, but also you've got like data-driven content, so content loaded from some other system or content that's used to drive applications that may not be readily authored. So let's see. Ruben asked, "Are we going to release a sample Maven project?" Actually, I hadn't had time to do that, but I think that would certainly be something that I'll definitely consider doing after this project's done. Is get a sample Maven project put together, and we could talk, or maybe even base it off the archetype as well. And Jason asks about compiled JSPs. Yes, so this is a problem that I've seen quite a few times where CQ will compile JSPs, and then when you deploy your code, even though you've changed the JSPs, it won't recompile them because it seems to think the timestamps are off. This seems to occur when you have servers that are running on different times. And the only way to really resolve this is to, as part of your build process, actually wipe out the cache folder for the JSPs. Oh, Dinesh is asking. Okay, so I think, let's see here. So Dinesh asked about the Maven repository, and there is actually one really strange thing about that I've noticed, and I don't know why it's the case. When you browse that repository, for some reason you need to go to ComDay. Before that it throws it'll just throw a 404. I think it's that they're proxying it through something. And Fernando's asking about I18N and language content. Where do we store it? My preference, I actually wrote a small blog post about this. My preference is actually to store it more like design than like content. And I think, if we're talking about pure localization of just fragments of text, like let's say submit buttons and that sort of thing, it almost can be treated more like it's a part of the application than content. And I think that it should be stored under Etsy, and you can create your own language bundles pretty much wherever you want in the repository, but I think storing it under Etsy kind of makes sense just from the way that Etsy is generally used in CQ. And if you go to 6dlabs.com, there is a write-up about the CQ5 CQ5 language manager, which is available in CQ5, 4, and 5.5, and how to create language packs and all that sort of thing. Are there any other questions or anything? If I missed your question, raise your hand. Otherwise, thanks everyone for showing up. I really appreciate the great turnout. There'll be some. Oops, someone raised their hand. Okay, Alex, what question did you have? Sorry. Some dummy project structure. Well, that's what Alex asked if I can share some dummy project structure, and that's what I was addressing with this slide here. So it's just kind of an outline. I think, honestly, probably one of the better things to do would be to take a look at the archetype that I'm going back to find the link for it, that CQ Blueprints has produced, and take a look at how they set up their project from the archetype, and that'd probably be the easiest way to go. Well, thank you, Bob, for explaining. Yeah, so they've locked down the root of the Nexus repository, so that's why we can't access anything below ComDay. That makes sense. Thank you, Bob. So Valisa asked, or said, in CQ5.5 the installs folder was removed, so there's any other place we can FTP and install the bundles. Well, that's part of the reason that we want to use Maven, and we want to use these plugins to automatically deploy packages. And once you get to that point, all your code will be contained. The bundles actually be contained inside the package, and then it'll install automatically. So if that makes sense, and that's also part of the reason why we want to have one single project artifact, so that when you go to install, you don't have to install multiple things. It just goes. Well, once again, any other questions or anything anyone else would like to propose or ask? Thank you, everybody, for your time. Hope you have a